like most people, you kind of get sucked up in the day-to-day work, in the grind, and kind of leave the fitness stuff behind. And yeah, in end of 2019, found myself morbidly obese. Hadn't trained in nearly 10 years at that point. IBS, on SSRIs for anxiety, depression, pre-diabetic at the time. I do some weightlifting. I post some videos now and again that seem to upset a lot of people because they seem to think I should be carb loading, but all my lifts are going up. I'm getting stronger. Most of the sports science research at the moment, up until this point, will have been funded by industry, by companies like Gatorade, Lucozade, etc. Why would they pay for so much research? Well, because they have billions invested in selling us sugar water. And in 1912, they were talking about using low-carb diets, even carnivore diets.
Today, I'm really happy we've got Mike Sweeney, also known as a low-carb RD, all the way from the UK today. We're going to discuss, I guess, all things nutrition a little bit. So, Mike, give us a little bit of your background. Obviously, I'm looking at you, look like you're a guy who works out a little bit, so I like that. So, tell us your background, man.
Yeah, cool. You're right. I do lift weights. I love lifting weights, to be fair. But yeah, background. So I've been a registered dietitian since 2014. I have an undergrad in sports science. That's where I started. Did dietetics as a postgrad. Currently work for the NHS and obviously all things clinical. And yeah, that's me. Love lifting weights. Love eating a lot of meat. And yeah, I guess that kind of begs the question how I got into the carnivore diet and low carb eating and all of that kind of stuff, really, which is, as most people did, found myself with a bunch of clinical issues to solve. So leading up to 2019, kind of got myself in pretty bad shape. So I'd left the NHS, run a business for 7 years, really successful. Like most people, you get sucked up in the day-to-day work, in the grind, and leave the fitness stuff behind, unfortunately. And that was a big lesson learned, not to do that. And yeah, in end of 2019, found myself morbidly obese with a BMI of 35, 36. Hadn't trained in nearly 10 years at that point. IBS, on SSRIs for anxiety, depression. Pre-diabetic at the time. My HbA1c was around 5.7%, 5.8%. So definitely creeping up. And to be honest, I came into the whole carnivore thing just purely by mistake, really. So at the start of 2020, that's when the world was going into lockdown. And fortunately, I have a friend who owns a gym. And he was like, look, just come and use the office. You can get your work done and etc. And that's when I just sat down and just thought, what am I going to do? I need to fix this. Overweight. I've got all these health problems, really. And just did this massive mind map. Not many people know this. I just thought, I need to lose weight. What can I do? As we both know, there's loads of options, count calories, etc. So I wrote down all the options, and then I thought, what am I going to do with my mental health? I wrote down all the options, and at the time I'd read a few studies around how ketogenic diets were helping people with bipolar, schizophrenia, etc. So I thought, low carb seems like a good option there. And with the IBS stuff, I've got SIBO-dominant IBS. I don't know if anybody knows anything about that, but it's just characterized by this excess intestinal fermentation of starches and fiber mostly. So when I was thinking through that, what could I do? The low-carb diet was an option, but as we both know, it's incredibly complicated. So I just decided I could just cut all that stuff out. Low-carb diet, that makes sense. I just worked my way through the decision tree, as it were, and landed upon low-carb, and that's what I did at the start for the first half of 2020, lost a bunch of weight, felt great. And then towards the end of the year, I just noticed, as I was optimizing for my gut health and all of that stuff, I just noticed all I was eating was meat. And that was at the point where I just thought, do you know what? I'm going to look into what these carnivore diet guys are saying, because I'd heard a lot of stuff about it, but never really looked into it. I suppose, like most people in my position, being a dietitian, working for the healthcare system, I'd heard of it, and I thought, it just seems like maybe an extreme extension of the whole keto thing. And even I thought that as somebody who's always been into low-carb dieting. Even when I was studying sports science, I followed Jeff Volek's research for many years. Most of his research started in strength athletes. And so I'd always had an interest, but I still flirt that. And it's only when I found myself just eating the majority meat, and that's when I felt my best. That's when I thought, let me look into what these guys are saying. And then that's when I got on YouTube, looked at your videos, Dr. Chilfie's videos, and a few other people, read some stuff and went deep down a rabbit hole and found some really surprising stuff. And that was, Q4 in 2020. And we're in 2024 now, so it's been a little while,
Let me ask you with regard to the NHS, is there like a script that you have to read from? Do
Yes.
they basically say, hey, if you're an RD, you need to preach this particular diet, and if you don't, you're on you become a pariah, and I hear from dietitians in here in the States that sometimes, depending where they work, they are constrained about what they're allowed to say. And if they say something besides that, they get in trouble with the licensing boards and things like that. Is that an issue in the NHS?
It's an interesting one because officially there's no script. However, at dietitian school, as I will call it, postgrad degree for me, what you are taught is the eat well plate is called here, food pyramid, I think it is over there. It's the same all over the Western world, mostly grains, avoid red meat, avoid fat, etc. That's what you're taught. And it's up to the individuals to question it. I was always that individual, sort of having heated discussions with the lecturers. I had assignments marked down all of the time because I was writing about low-carb diets, and they were telling me that's not evidence-based, despite the fact I would have 70-odd citations for what I was saying. And within the NHS specifically, again, there are no official, there's no official script to say you have to do this. However, the assumption is that you will. Obviously, we have things like national guidelines, etc., and they all say the same thing. So most dietitians do follow the script, as you say, but I don't have to. This is the interesting thing. So the governing body, HCPC, it's called in the UK, there's a set of rules, professional code of conduct that we have to follow for our profession, and nowhere in those rules does it say you have to do this diet with every single patient in every context all of the time. But I don't really see how they could ever get to that point because it doesn't make sense. There is no evidence for that. And I like to remind people that the meaning of the word guidelines, right? Guide, the clue's in the name. It's a guide. It's maybe a starting point. If you know nothing, if I get presented with a patient that has a clinical condition I know nothing about, I might look to the guidelines for a starting point. But it is just that. It's a starting point. And so to answer your question, officially there's no script. Most dietitians do follow the national guidelines though. And as for do you become a pariah, it's an interesting one because the NHS, most people don't know this, but the NHS is divided up all across the country, and it's technically lots of different companies. Like all over, it has the same branding, of course, but everybody has different budgets, obviously different teams and different managers, etc. So if you end up in a good team, so the trust that I work for at the moment is a really good team, really progressive. They're really keen on research, doing something different. They acknowledge that all the statistics across primary care, everything's falling flat on its face. Diabetes is through the roof, complications of that are through the roof, like all the gastrointestinal issues are through, everything's getting worse and worse. So they're really open to stuff. So I'm really lucky in the trust where I'm at the moment. Previous trust that I worked for, I won't name it for this reason, that wasn't the case. They're a very close-minded team. And again, I was that individual having arguments with managers all of the time because they would say, Mike, what you're doing is not evidence-based. And I would say, look, here's 50 scientific studies that have already been done. And this kind of backs up what I'm doing. And we'd have those kind of arguments all of the time. So yeah, it's a funny one.
But usually, and again, I don't know what your situation, you said you work for a trust, but a lot of, they're different dietitians. Some are inpatient, they're formulating TPNs, and some are outpatient, and a lot of people send their diabetics to and whatnot. What is the capacity that a dietitian is usually utilized in the UK? Is it basically as part of a medical treatment team, or is it standalone type of stuff?
Yeah, again, another interesting question. So for me, in my current job, so I'm a PCN dietitian, I'm standalone. I work in primary care, so in the community, and I am the team. I deal with everything from diabetes, referrals, type 1, type 2, IBS, Crohn's disease, allergies, obviously weight management, obesity, all sorts of things. And so that's what I do. But you are right, we do have specialist dietitians that only work in the hospitals and only do nutrition support, tube feeding, etc. But yeah, I'm in the community, so I do everything, which is good because it keeps my job varied. And I've been doing this now for nearly 15 years, so I've got a wide clinical experience, which definitely helps.
Have you always practiced a low carb approach, or in the beginning of your career, were you more of the typical model? Or was there a transition point?
Yeah, great question. So ever since university, like I said, I always had, because I come from a sports science background, so I always had an interest in low carb. And then even when I moved into dietetics, I kept maintained that interest in low carb, but I was still middle of the road, if you like. Happy to support people with low carb if that's what they wanted to do, but also happy for people to do other stuff if that's what they wanted to do. And even for myself, there would be times where I just competed in bodybuilding for 3, 4, almost 5 years, did an ultra low fat, very high carb diet, won a couple of trophies at that. So I've been on that end of the spectrum. So just always one of those sat in the middle. And then for me, it became definitely a personal lifestyle choice at the start of 2020. Like I said, when I realized, wow, I have all these issues to fix, and just going through my own mind map of my own decision tree of just like, okay, because clinicians always say, like we both heard this many times, they say, do whatever diet you want as long as you can stick to it. And that's what I was doing with myself. And that's when it became a permanent lifestyle change for me in 2020. And then since then, of course, I don't force low carb on anybody, but I think by nature of the food environment, it's heavily polluted with refined carbohydrates all over the place. You can't even buy a jar of bolognese sauce anymore without it being filled with refined starches, refined sugars of all sorts. So I do find myself, for the most part, advising people to eat less bread, eat less pasta, get less sugar, etc., etc. Yeah, so definitely.
I want to maybe, because I think you and I both share an interest in activity and physical activity, and I've set world records on a carnivore diet without carbohydrates, and yet people will tell me that's the wrong thing to do, and you need to be eating all these carbs. And I in fact, I just got back from South Carolina where I lectured in front of one of the most, I don't know if it's prestigious, but it was one of the most well-regarded strength and conditioning coaches conference. And I talked about different needs at different stages in an athlete's life and different options and different choices about energy. And my sort of thought is you do best on what you're adapted to chronically. What are your thoughts around athletic performance and low carb diets? Is it always going to be second tier? Can you have optimal best performance without? What are your thoughts on that? And is there any literature that you would go to support that?
Yeah, definitely. So my thoughts on this is, obviously, I would say, depending on the energy needs of the sport, right? There are some sports where you are engaging in extremely high intensity, repetitive bouts for extremely long periods of time that might be more glycolytically demanding. Meaning your body can't produce quite enough energy just from fat, can't get enough oxygen into the system to do that. So there are some sports where having some muscle glycogen is going to be helpful. But I would agree with you in terms of it depends what you're chronically adapted to and depends on the context of the sport. I know we've got people like Zach Bitter on Twitter, and he's also smashed loads of world records in ultra distance kind of events. And we've seen loads of those people over the years. And that also makes sense because if the intensity is sort of low enough for long enough periods, you can obviously produce enough fat. Jeff Volek, Stephen Finney have produced lots of research and wrote some amazing books on this topic. So for me, my personal stance is having some muscle glycogen is contextually useful. Is it essential? Not really. I was just reading some research the other day on weightlifting because, as you mentioned, I do some weightlifting. I post some videos now and again that seem to upset a lot of people because they seem to think I should be carb loading, but all my lifts are going up, I'm getting stronger, etc., etc. And the research I was reading on this literally just last week was showing that for elite athletes that do 20 working sets to failure on squats, they only deplete the muscle glycogen levels by 26%. Now, these would have been carb-loaded athletes, right? So we don't have data on what happens if we take somebody like yourself, put them through exactly the same protocol. You will be fat adapted, as will I at this point. Put them through exactly the same protocol. What happens? We don't have those studies. Nobody's ever done those studies. And if you read the studies all around the supposed performance-enhancing benefits of carbohydrates, specifically in weightlifting, all of those papers acknowledge the fact that we don't have the studies to see what would happen if people were more fat adapted. And I think part of that is, as you will know, and this goes for the sports science side and also the clinical side, is the majority of research is published by industry. most of the sports science research at the moment, up until this point, will have been funded by industry, by companies like Gatorade, Lucozade, etc. Why would they pay for so much research? Because they have billions invested in selling us sugar water. Like, that's their business model. Same on the clinical side. Pharma are more than happy to pay for research if it will potentially bolster their sort of argument or get a new drug approved, etc. They're not really too happy to pay for research into ketogenic diets and mental health. Why? Because it might mean that some people come off the drugs, and that's of no financial benefit to them. And that all sounds like some wild conspiracy theory. However, that is the capitalistic truth of the world that we live in, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got a study on inflammatory bowel disease, a nice case series with really good data that we've already written up, and the IRB is sitting on it and won't push it through because
no way.
It's Carnivore. Yeah.
No way.
We've got two universities that are both dragging their feet. We only submitted this stuff 6 months ago and still not been through the IRB. So it's very frustrating to see how they push back against anything, even getting research published against the narrative. And one thing I will comment on is that I talked to a guy named Phil Prinz he's out of Groves College in Pennsylvania, and there's a study with Andrew Kutnick, Tim Noakes, Jeff Bullock, and others looking at ketogenic diets and chronically more adapted athletes. And they found that basically no difference in performance at high intensity. And they also found that one of the interesting things was that the high carb athletes, about a third of them had pre-diabetic fasting blood glucoses. Now, these were all middle-aged men that were very competitive in their sport. And then the other thing they found was that it may not be glycogen that predicts a drop in performance. It's actually blood glucose. And so you can maintain blood glucose with much lower levels of carbohydrate rather than the big carb loading. So it calls into question some of these sort of beliefs about muscle glycogen. As you mentioned, it's hard to fully deplete your glycogen. It's damn near impossible to fully deplete muscle glycogen. Maybe you get to a Olympic marathon distance at that intensity. And I think I agree with you. How much carb loading do I need to do to pull a 1-rep deadlift max? It lasts 2 seconds. You don't need a carb load for that.
Exactly. Yeah. We had some data that was published in the last few years, just showing the difference between muscle glycogen levels between low carb sort of athletes and high carb athletes, and over the medium to long term there was no difference, even though they weren't eating many carbs. So yeah, 100%. But it does become contextually useful on the fringes of the intensity. In theory, I've got a friend at the moment who's training long distance runs, and he's been fat adapted for the last 2 or 3 years, and he just did a 20k run last week, fasting, no carbs, no sugar water, no nothing, did it perfectly fine. And this guy's not even an athlete. He's just somebody just training for long distance because that's what he's currently into, and so it's doable. But again, there's these studies cost a lot of money, so who's going to pay £500,000 to do the studies just to prove a point? Yeah, it's a funny one.
Yeah, let me ask you about dietary fat. Dietary fat is vilified, particularly saturated fat. Saturated fat is associated with higher LDL cholesterol, which is associated with cardiovascular disease, and therefore we should not be eating saturated fat. U.S. dietary guidelines recommend, I think, 10% cap on how many calories can come from a percentage of our calories coming from saturated fat. They wanted to go down to 7% at some point, and I think somebody's pushed back against that. But I mean, are we inappropriately vilifying saturated fat? Is it only in the context of caloric excess that it's an issue? Is it the context of, I look at saturated fat in the U.S., and I think how much saturated fat in the U.S. diet is coming from actual whole unprocessed meat? It's about 3%. The rest of it's coming from desserts and snacks and prepared foods and all that. But what are your thoughts on saturated fat?
For me, personally, I've not really seen any convincing data that suggests saturated fat is unhealthy in any way, with the caveat of, like you just said, if we're talking about eating beef and eggs, etc. To date, and of course, nobody's read all of the research, so I'm not pretending like I have. I'm just saying, in my 15 years of doing this job, I've never come across any piece of research that convincingly shows, okay, saturated fat is really bad. Even the whole LDL thing. I know there's, especially on Twitter, there's a lot of noise about, if you eat saturated fat, your LDL and ApoB goes up, and then you're going to die early, etc., etc. Here's what's interesting about that. So, like I said, since the end of 2020, I eat beef twice a day, eat eggs at least twice a day. I'm often adding butter to my meals, so I'm not short on saturated fat. As of March this year, which is just a month or two ago, my ApoB is less than 100, it's 75. My LDL is perfectly normal. All my other biomarkers are perfectly normal. I think my clinical experience suggests that is the norm. When we see all the LMHR stuff of people eating lots of saturated fat and their LDL goes through the roof, that's the exception. And I think if all is what's online, you could be tricked into believing that's the norm. But that's not the norm. I've been using low-carb diets with patients for quite a few years, and they lose weight, cardiovascular disease, biomarkers, everything improves. Everything gets closer to normal than it was. And outside of that, like I said, I've never seen any convincing data that in that context, eating saturated fat. And of course, on the other side of that coin is if we chronically overconsume saturated fat, is that a problem? But chronically overconsuming most things is going to be a problem. And the irony, I think, of the ultra-low-fat dogma, and it is a dogma at this point, because there's so much evidence to suggest that it's arguably completely wrong, not always the right thing to be doing. But the irony of that is if you eat very low fat, but you're over-consuming carbohydrates, and you'll probably over-consume sugar at that point as well, especially if you're eating bread, bagels, all these things that tend to fall into that category, your body will produce saturated fat from excess carbohydrates. I tell my patients all the time, if you are not moving like an elite athlete, why are you eating like an elite athlete? Your body can store some muscle glycogen, which is fantastic. It's safe in there. But if it can't do that, it will store it as fat. And most of that will be saturated fat. So even the people that are trying their best, like you said, aiming for 7% of calories of saturated fat, what's going to happen? You're going to eat more pasta because you thought that was good, but your body's going to make some saturated fat anyway. And I see this clinically with patients who have been low-fat diets all of their lives, and they have high cholesterol, high LDL, they're on statins. Like I see this all of the time. And even if you have one case that disproves the theory, that tells me, okay, like it's not airtight, so that's not the thing. It might be useful for some people, but not for all. And so to blanket recommend that across the board, to me, is malpractice, I think, personally.
Yeah, you raise a very interesting point, because particularly palmitic acid, which is produced in the liver through de novo lipogenesis, which certainly occurs, and we know that carbohydrates, anything that's got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen can be rearranged into a fat. And so it's interesting that there is an associated with saturated fat in the blood and, say, insulin resistance. However, it's not predicated upon how much saturated fat we eat, but how much our liver converts. And Volek has shown in a number of studies that higher saturated fat in the diet does not correlate with higher saturated fat in the blood. In fact, some cases it correlates with lower saturated fat, which is...
But that's in a low-carb context, right? Yeah, I remember that study.
In a low carb. Yeah, in a low carb.
Yeah, if you keep your carbs low enough, then you don't end up with lots of saturated fat in the blood, and it doesn't accumulate in the cells, which is obviously where it starts to cause. Yeah, I remember that study. It was a really good one.
Yeah, I think it was 2013. I think, if I'm not mistaken. But so we've got that sort of misbelief about saturated fat being a problem, and I would say it's context, like everything else. Is it in a low carb context? Is my saturated fat coming from birthday cake and ice cream? That's a different context than if I'm getting it from a steak. And then of course there are many different types of saturated fat, whether it's palmitic or oleic or stearic or on and on, myristic and lauric, all those.
And there was
different length carbons.
There is one type of saturated fat. I'm not going to remember it now, but you just reminded me of it. So there was a research study that came out a few years ago, suggesting that this specific type of saturated fat might be conditionally essential. And that was, I'm trying to remember the name of that, I'm going to escape it, but they did some research like in dolphins and marine animals, and then demonstrated it in like the lungs of humans. And that was really interesting. So you could start to see then, actually, we do need this. And of course, look, we do. We've been eating saturated fat for millions of years. Heart disease, diabetes, all of the things that they try to blame on saturated fat have not been around for millions of years. We know that. So even if that's all you knew, all the epidemiologists tell me all the time that epidemiology it's a perfect science, etc. And I don't agree with that. However, if we track through history, we can already see that there are holes in that theory straight off the bat. So why are we continuing to push something that is potentially false, made up? And that's even before we get into all the Ansel Keys stuff, even the stuff with the LDL. LDL being causative of heart disease, etc. There's enough, and I know you've seen it, there's enough data on the opposite side of that coin to suggest that people with low LDL tend to not live as long. People with high LDL tend to live longer and healthier. And this is fairly solid research. And so we've got research on both sides of the coin. However, medicine continues to go just a cherry pick, really. That is the definition of cherry picking. Like, we like these studies here, we don't like these other ones over here, so we'll ignore them and we'll keep doing this thing. That's the definition of cherry picking. And that, to be honest, that really angers me. It gets me angry because people like us who follow a low carb carnivore diet, whatever that looks like for people, even if it's like keto, etc., we're blown for being cherry pickers, for being zealots, etc. But to me, it seems like the real zealotry, the real cherry picking comes from trying to maintain the mainstream dogma in the face of all of the competing evidence. Whereas I don't understand, as a clinician, healthcare is supposed to be patient-centered. All of the research suggests if we act in a patient-centered way, so we ask our patients what they would like to achieve and we support them, we give them choices. Which treatment choice is best for you? You decide, you're the expert on your life. But we don't do any of that. Like, the mainstream thing is, it's a low-fat diet or nothing, go over there. If that doesn't work, we'll just give you medication. There are no choices, and that's not patient-centered in the slightest. And that's, yeah, like I said, it really makes me angry because, as I'm sure you did, I got into the kind of work that I do because I love helping people. I love nothing more than somebody asks for some advice, you give some advice, they go away, they come back and tell you, oh, my Crohn's is in remission, my diabetes is in remission, I don't have IBS anymore, my psoriasis has gone away. I love hearing those stories. And that's why I got into it. But yeah, it just really makes me angry when the mainstream narrative is just, here's... So that's the thing, right? So in dietitian school, they told us that there's no, at least on the course I was on, there's no magic diet. And then in the same breath, they say there's no single magic diet that can fix everything for anybody. Okay, cool, got that one. In the next sentence, here is the eat well, the food pyramid, and you can put everybody on this. And just saying it out loud there, it just sounds like a bit of a bad joke, but that is what's said. And it's the same with the LDL stuff. It's LDL will lead to heart disease, therefore we need to put you all on statins. So hang on a minute. We've got this competing evidence, and this competing evidence, none of it's been retracted, so it's obviously fairly solid. So how do you compartmentalize that? And of course they don't, they just ignore it. And then obviously that begs the question, why would they do that? And this is where a lot of the conspiracy theories find some sort of traction, if you like, because it certainly looks a certain way, doesn't it?
Yeah, obviously the conflicts of interest they're not even hidden.
Ridiculous.
It's obvious and open. You've got major, at least in the US, you have major dietitians group, which clearly get funding from these processed food companies. There's clear conflicts of interest in the USDA, who prescribes the National Dietary Guidelines. So almost at this point, it's almost laughable, and yet they just do it blatantly, which is, and people accept it, which is a really sad thing, because I think in a lot of ways they're just addicted. They're just addicted to this food and they can't stop. And so they're just like, okay, we've addicted everybody. There's nothing they can do about it. Do you find, you said that you saw people like Crohn's disease and other things. What have you, because we often think about dietitians and diets as in weight loss. Now, that's maybe a little bit about diet around diabetes, but in my experience, I've been talking about this obviously for years now, the diet, and particularly the type of diet, because one of the criticisms we'll see is the only reason your Crohn's disease is better is because you lost weight and you went into a caloric deficit. And that's not what I've seen, because I've seen a lot of people that have lost weight. A lot of times Crohn's disease, they're skinny. They can't absorb anything. And so if it's a caloric deficit that's making all these problems go away, how does that work when someone puts weight back on? I talked to a gal with anorexia bulimia for 40 years. She was underweight at 70 pounds. And obviously a caloric deficit didn't fix her. What are your thoughts around the people who will say, oh, the only reason a carnivore diet is effective is because you lose weight? And I tend to push back on it. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. In terms of Crohn's disease specifically, I literally just spoke to a patient of mine the other day, exactly what you just said. This individual hasn't lost any weight inside of 6 to 8 weeks, has put his Crohn's disease into remission, symptom-free, he's come off all of his medication. And that was despite his gastroenterologist telling him, diet has nothing to do with Crohn's disease, you have to take your medication. Fortunately, he didn't listen to that, didn't take that to heart. So I mean, that disease has almost nothing to do with weight loss at all. And for everybody else listening, Crohn's disease being inflammatory bowel disease, of course, you can have fat buildup, around the outside in the bowels there, and that obviously can be pro-inflammatory. In my experience, exactly the same. Almost none of my Crohn's disease patients lose weight. We modify their diet, generally reducing starches, reducing fiber, this individual eating more meat. The big one is getting people off the processed food, of course. That makes a massive difference. But yeah, absolutely nothing to do with weight loss at all. And it's funny that you mentioned there about maybe everybody thinks of dietitians, all they do is help people lose weight. There's only a small percentage of my patients that are sort of weight management, we call it obesity patients. We've got two extremes there. I've got the bariatric patients, I've got people who aren't quite there yet but need to lose weight. But also have all people living with diabetes, lots of gastrointestinal disorders like Crohn's disease that we're talking about now. IBS is massive, and that's a growing problem. And not many people are talking about that, to be fair. It's even growing in children, which, think about that. So why would IBS, and bearing in mind that anything, and there's good research on this, so anything up to 80% of IBS cases are actually small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which is dysbiosis of the microbiome, basically, where we've got the microbiome becoming overgrown with gas-forming bacteria. That produces all the bacteria, intestinal pressure. We get loss of histamine release, changes in bowel movements, acid reflux, etc., etc. The list goes on. So why would that be happening in children? Now, that suggests to me that the children are eating more ultra-processed foods than any time in history. So that suggests to me it's definitely the diet that is bringing on that dysbiosis, that change in the composition of the microbiome. And yeah, so I see a lot of those patients as well. So yeah, it's interesting that, yeah, if people think that dietitians, all they do is help people lose weight, it's sometimes the case, but not for me.
It's interesting, and I've heard that repeatedly from many patients who've gone to gastroenterologists, and I've heard from gastroenterologists that diet has no bearing on XY disease, digestive disease, which makes zero sense to me, particularly like when you absolutely see these people putting their disease in remission. I think at some point, if they say, hey, look, there's a diet that fixes this stuff, then they almost go out of business in a way. It doesn't behoove them financially to say diet is effective and you don't need me anymore, because then you become superfluous. If a dietary intervention can fix Crohn's disease, and you don't need the GI guy to do a colonoscopy, an endoscopy, prescribe you medications. So it's the same thing. A patient cured is a customer lost. And I do think we're up against that in a way.
Unfortunately, yeah, and you are 100% right. So what most people that don't work in healthcare don't realize is that healthcare, the way it's set up, is a very perverse incentive system. Meaning, in the UK, this is exactly how it works, and I've confirmed this with many of my friends whom are doctors, gastroenterologists, etc. across the board. This will be exactly the same in the US, I have no doubt. But the way it works, generally speaking, is that doctors only really get paid when they refer or when they prescribe something. Now, all this is public information. I'm not saying anything controversial. It's all documented online, free for anybody to read. Obviously, there's lots of management lingo in that document, but ultimately it boils down to doctors get paid if they refer on to more specialty services. So you go to your GP with all this GI pain, etc. They'll refer on to gastroenterology. They get paid there. Maybe in the interim, they'll put you on omeprazole or some kind of PPI or something to try and help. They'll get paid for that prescription. And that's what they get paid for. And it'll be the same for the more specialist consultants. They'll get paid every time they do a colonoscopy or an endoscopy. They'll get paid every time they put you on a different drug or whatever. What they don't get paid for is to sit with you for 3 hours and to go through your diet history, to try to figure out what's causing the problem. Maybe it's a chronic stress problem. Maybe that's part of the situation. That doctor, if they did that, they could change your life in that 3 hours. It wouldn't even take 3 hours, to be fair. I know from personal experience. But let's assume they spent 3 hours and they fundamentally changed your life for the better. That doctor, or at least that department, obviously the doctor will get his salary, but the department doesn't get paid. And at some point along the chain, somebody will have a problem with that, of course. Now, don't get me wrong. I've got lots of friends who are doctors. We all get into the line of work we get into because we love helping people. That's why we get into it. Undoubtedly, that's why you got into the line of work that you got into. But eventually, when you've been in it for a while, you start to realize, hang on a minute. For example, in the UK at the moment, GPs have 8 minutes to spend with patients. 8 minutes. So if I go to my GP right now and say, look, I've got these new symptoms, XYZ, they have 8 minutes. They have no time to ask me anything of like with any meaning at all. So it's refer on or prescribe, refer on or prescribe. It'll be the same for the consultants. You get a little bit more time. And most, like I said, most people not working in healthcare don't realize that. And I think that's important to point out because especially on Twitter, it's very easy to go, doctors don't care. They're horrible, evil people. And I see these kind of comments all the time. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure some of them are, but I'm sure the majority of them are the same as us. They want people to do well, but they're constrained by the system that they're working in. I'm fortunate in the line of work that I do. I am my own team. I have no oversight, so I get to choose, right? If I've got Mrs. Jones, who was a bariatric patient, I can spend an hour with her. That's fine. I can spend more with her if I need to. And then the next patient, maybe I only need 20 minutes. I can be flexible, so I'm really fortunate in that sense, but not everybody is. And this is where I get to the idea that it's a top-down issue. Everybody on the ground level, I know Dr. David Unwin is doing fantastic stuff, publishing lots of data from the ground up. Why is he doing that? Because he's tried to go to the top level. Nobody wants to change anything at the top. And then that begs the question, why not? We all want to see our patients do well.
Yeah, I think more importantly, they want to keep the status quo and they want to keep the money. That's interesting because the UK, within the NHS, it seems to me like there would be some incentive to save money. And David Unwin, a good friend of mine, has clearly demonstrated that he can save money for the NHS. And yet, it falls on deaf ears, and perhaps because the people at the top may be financially benefiting from the system as it is, and they don't want to jeopardize that, perhaps.
Exactly, yeah. For everybody else listening, so Dr. David Unwin so far has published 2 studies. One, I believe, in 2016, saved 47 grand that year on diabetes drugs by putting people on a low-carb diet, and then came back in 2022, published a paper in the BMJ, saved, I believe it was, if I get the number right, £67,000 that year by putting diabetic patients on a low-carb diet. Some of them still had medications. That's absolutely fine, but you're absolutely right. We hear all the time in the media here, the NHS doesn't have money, it's collapsing, it's going to go bankrupt, etc. And here we have an individual that says, look, we can deploy this lifestyle intervention and we can save nearly 70 grand a year, but that's just in one GP practice. Now we have, I don't know how many GP practices across the country, it has to be thousands. So imagine if everybody was saving that kind of money. Yeah, so Dr. David Unwin, so in 2022, published his paper, put a bunch of people living with diabetes on a low-carb diet, saved £67,000 in medication expense that year. And then I was saying that we hear all the time in the UK that the NHS doesn't have enough money, need to save money, it's going to go bankrupt, all this fear-mongering type stuff. And here we have an individual that has a lifestyle intervention that can save, not only improve the quality of life for the individuals, improve the sort of working life of the doctors, because everybody loves to see their patients do well, but also save nearly £70,000, and that's just one GP surgery. We've got many thousands of GP surgeries all around the country. So it baffles me why the people at the top haven't seen that and gone, wow, that's fantastic. Let's put £500,000 into that. Let's get that all across the country. Because the reality is they're always going to need drugs, right? There are always going to be individuals that don't want to change their lifestyle. So the drugs are always going to be needed. And this is why I don't understand the resistance or almost like trying to shut it down and pretend like it doesn't exist. Like I see Dr. David Unwin all the time on Twitter, and he's always tagging Diabetes UK, and he's always tagging the dietitians, but they never reply. And I've even asked him, do they ever reply? And he says, no, they don't. And I know he's been to Parliament and nothing's come of it. And we have an organisation, the NHS, technically it is a company, it's a private organisation, it's struggling for money. And here we have a fantastic way to save a ton of money and nobody's interested. Wow. Like if I could save £70,000 a year for my own life, I would definitely be doing whatever that is. So, but again, it begs the question, why would you not be interested in that?
Yeah, it seems like it might be of benefit to patients, which seem to get, maybe they're an afterthought when it comes to how we dictate healthcare. Because
unfortunately,
in the United States, medicine has largely been, obviously it's a business, it's now corporatized. Most of these large healthcare entities are buying out all the small independent practices, and so everybody has to toe the line or they're out in a way, and so it's becoming monopolized, almost becoming a monopoly in a way. So it's quite disconcerting to see that. Obviously, there's a ground-up approach. There's a lot of a grassroots. People are saying we're sick of the we're sick of the healthcare status quo. It's not serving our interests in the way it should be in their view and my view as well. Do you see through this groundswell in the UK? Because I know in the US I'm seeing it, and obviously our company Revero is obviously part of that. But do you see more people taking an interest in this, or is it or more people being almost manipulated and forced into this sort of low-fat plant-based kind of thing that's being talked about?
Yeah, it's a great question. So fortunately, I do see more and more ground up movements like what you suggested there. Obviously, we've got Dr. David Unwin, we've many doctors here in the UK, and I'm not going to remember all their names now. I just did a training course recently with one of them. He's an endocrinologist, does a lot of low carb stuff with his diabetic patients. We've got multiple conferences being put on now. I know about public health collaboration, they're quite big, but there are other conferences being put on literally by independent GPs that are, like you said, just sick and tired of not seeing their patients do well, right? And they've gravitated to some variation of low carb. And that looks very different for all sorts of people. But yeah, more and more sort of ground level movement, people putting on their own conferences, delivering their own training courses. Fortunately, as clinicians, we still have the autonomy to help our patients decide what's best for them. I think if that ever was to change, I think you'd see a mass exodus of clinicians. Absolutely. And to be honest, if it wasn't for that sort of ground level sort of change that is happening, like people like me, like we would quit, because more often than not we see the dogmatic approach doesn't change. So even in my own department, and I don't want to sound too braggadocious here, but my colleagues being dietitians ask me all the time, oh, how are you able to get those kinds of results with your IBS patients? Or how are you able to get so many of your patients into remission living with diabetes? How are you able to do XYZ? And it is because I'm approaching it differently. And don't get me wrong, I'm doing nothing clever. None of it is my original idea. This has already been done before. So much I have a copy of a manual of dietetic practice, it's called, which is the Bible for people like myself. You qualify, you buy this book, and it tells you everything you need to know. I have one of those books from 1912. And in 1912, they were talking about using low-carb diets, even carnivore diets. Now, of course, it wasn't called carnivore diets, but Dr. Salisbury was using a meat-exclusive diet to get rid of psoriasis and to treat diabetes, obesity, right? So people like me have been doing this stuff literally forever. It's just at some point along the way, and I've not traced at what point does it change, but I suspect it has something to do with the injection of industry and the whole fiasco with heart disease and stuff. I've not traced it yet, but I suspect it'll be exactly the same timeline.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct in that this has been talked about. It goes back to even prior to Salisbury. John Rollo, who's Scottish surgeon back in the late 1700s, was prescribing all meat diets for diabetes. So this, and probably even before then, it was probably used in some form. But yeah, so none of it's new, but it's worked then and it works now, and human physiology hasn't changed dramatically. What happened is I just view most of the food in the store as toxic. Somebody go as far as saying it's even poisonous to some degrees, depending on what they put in it. But I don't know if you've had much occasion to travel to the U.S., but it's quite sad when you walk around the U.S., any major city, town, and go to the grocery store, a case where there's a lot of people, and the obesity rates are just off the chart. And I know the UK, last time I was in the UK was, I think, about a year ago, and it's increasing probably. Surely it has, but it's not to the extent where maybe I don't know what the obesity rates in the UK are right now, probably 20%, I'm guessing, but 42% in growth.
Yeah, I believe it's closer to 30% here in the UK. Yeah, it might be like 26, 27, 28 around there, but it's definitely approaching a third. And I agree with you. Having been to the States, even 10 years ago, everybody was big, everybody was round. And I know that sounds horribly judgmental, but that is just an observation. But the same is the case here in the UK. A few months ago, I ended up in McDonald's. It's not a place I choose to eat very often, but on this occasion, just bought a bunch of beef and cheese. But what caught my attention was just standing in the queue at McDonald's and looking around. And I was the only in-shape person in the building. All of the customers were round, and even all the staff were young. They're all sort of teenagers alike or young adults. Everybody was round. And again, I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I just mean that in go back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s. Like, this was not the case at all. And that's just a random, not even trying to go out to find big people. And that's what you observe, unfortunately. Yeah, it's not good, is it?
Yeah, it certainly is. Of course, we've got Ozempic to save us. It's just like all the injections, which we'll see how that plays out. I'm very concerned about the number of people that will be long-term negatively impacted by that. And some people obviously do lose weight for sure. But again, I think if you don't implement the appropriate nutrition lifestyle, it's just a Band-Aid. It literally is a temporary Band-Aid, which I don't think is going to really benefit people over the long term. And of course, the drug companies want it because they want to keep you on it for the rest of your life, which it suits their business model, obviously.
Yeah, genius on their part. If their main concern, like I said, is business, so literally genius on their part. But yeah, right. So that's going to create a whole host of metabolic problems. Most people, when that all first kicked off here in the UK, and I think it was Novo Nordisk paid the NICE guidelines and sponsored their guidelines to get the GPs to prescribe it. And then I pulled up the original study that they used to justify it, and it was crazy. Like, they lost 30% weight in the 12 months that they'd used it, but 30% of that was muscle mass. Now, considering we have a crazy diabetes epidemic going on, I really don't think we want to take a bunch of people that have very minimal muscle mass to begin with, because they're all just eating mostly grains like they were told. So now they're all fairly sarcopenic and in some cases obese at the same time, and now they're going to lose 40% of that muscle mass. And what was crazy about that paper to me was they buried the muscle mass loss in the appendix, and in the paper they never once mentioned anything about lean body mass, muscle mass, never mentioned it at all. Which to me, I'm like, okay, like, what was your intention with literally just trying to ignore it at all? And then I gave a presentation this January down in a conference in London, an obesity conference, and I presented that paper and pointed that fact out. Look, yeah, it leads to fantastic weight loss. However, a large chunk of this is muscle mass loss, and we need to do something to offset that. Because if not, we're just going to be feeding the whole diabetes problem. And the crazy thing about that conference was there was a PhD there who we're talking about conflicts of interest recently, his conflict of interest statement was longer than his presentation. And what he had of his presentation was mostly trying to convince all of the doctors that lifestyle intervention was a waste of time. And that really said a lot to me. And that was literally just this year. And so that tells you about the intention of the pharmaceutical industry. If doctors give up on lifestyle intervention and then they're just going to dish out this drug, and I know they've announced recently that they've finally acknowledged the muscle mass loss and they have a new drug to try to offset that. People can see where it's going. And these drugs are not cheap in the UK. If you can get the GLP-1 drug for free for 2 years. After that, it costs anywhere from 160 to 250 pounds per month to use that. Now, the irony of that is a lot of my patients in primary care, people will tell me things like, oh, but Mike, I can't eat more meat because I can't afford it. But they want the injections. And I have to explain to them, look, I'm happy to support you with whatever you need to do, but after that 2 years is up, £250 a month for dollars, what's that going to be, like $300-400 a month? I'm telling you now, like, most people in the UK cannot afford that. That is not sustainable. I know in the US, medication usage, the cost is crazy, even more than that for things like insulin, etc. But in the UK, we don't have private medications yet. Most medications are prescribed. The cost is covered by the government. And this will be really interesting because this will be one of the first drugs where people are having to shell out of their own pocket. And most people aren't going to afford it 100%.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the long-term follow-up on the people that discontinue that, because one of the concerns is, my understanding is the GLP-1 receptor agonists lead to fat cell hyperplasia. So instead of large, big cells, they have small cells. The fat cells get smaller, but they become more numerous. And while they're under the influence of the drug, they stay small. But if you come off the drug, now you have more fat cells. And what happens when they start to enlarge? And then you end up maybe worse off than you were. Hey, Mike, unfortunately, we're just running out of time. So this has been fascinating, and I appreciate that. Share with the folks anything you want to share as far as maybe social media or anything else you want to share.
People can find me on Twitter. That's the best place. That's the only social media platform I'm on. So at the @Low-carb_RD. Send all the abuse there, or the whatever. Engage with people, and yeah.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for fighting the good fight. We need as many people on board as possible because this is a monumental task in front of us to try to, I don't know, save people from self-immolating, self-destruction. So anyway, all right. I appreciate it, Mike. Thanks so much.
No, cheers,
Appreciate
mate.
it. Have a good day.